Welcome to Understanding the State of Democracy Reform through 2020 State Ballot Initiatives. I'm Caleb Jackson, Legal Counsel for Voting Rights here at Campaign Legal Center, and would just like to thank you all for joining us. CLC is a national nonpartisan organization that works to advance democracy through law at the federal, state, and local levels. We fight for every American's right to participate in the democratic process. We believe our democracy should be transparent, accountable, and inclusive. Today, we will be having a conversation on trends in voting rights, money in politics, and citizen-led efforts to reform our democracy. Experts from states with some of the most talked about democracy reform ballot initiatives will offer a brief overview of these initiatives, along with an analysis of the specific issues that they have tried to address. We will discuss the challenges that grassroots organizers faced getting these initiatives on the ballot and convincing the people in their states to vote for these much needed democracy reforms. This will include considering how a highly partisan presidential election, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic, shaped the landscape that citizen activists had to navigate this year. Before I introduce today's panel, I would like to review a few housekeeping items for this afternoon's discussion. First, please use the comment section on Facebook or YouTube to submit your questions for members of the panel. After we have heard from our panel, we will start the question and answer portion of today's event. We will do our best to get to each question, but in the interest of time, we may not be able to cover them all. If we are not able to answer your question today, and you are a member of the press, please email your questions to media@campaignlegal.org. If you are a member of the public and we are not able to get to your question today, please email info@campaignlegal.org. Before I introduce the members of today's panel, I would like to let everyone know that Scott Kendall, a Republican lawyer who served as counsel for Alaska's Yes on Question 2 campaign, was scheduled to participate in our conversation, but unfortunately, he is no longer able to join us. In his absence, we wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the important work that Scott and Alaskans for Better Elections did to pass ranked choice voting and strengthen campaign finance disclosure laws in their state. Now, I would like to introduce the rest of today's panel. I'll begin with Danielle Lang. She is CLC's co-director of voting rights and redistricting and litigates a wide range of voting rights and redistricting matters before federal courts, including federal district courts, as well as the Supreme Court of the United States. This has included groundbreaking cases like the challenge to Texas's strict voter ID law and CLC's Florida felons voting right case. Secondly, I would like to welcome Sean Nicholson, who is a senior content strategist and research director at the political consulting firm GPS Impact. He has much experience with Missouri politics. He was the campaign manager for Clean Missouri from 2016 to 2018, and he led the effort to try to defeat the Dirty Missouri ballot initiative from passing earlier this year. The final member of our panel is Brian Cannon, who is the executive director of One Virginia 2021. This was the movement behind the successful passage of Virginia's new bipartisan Redistricting Commission, which voters approved with 66% of the vote back in November. Thank you to the members of the panel for joining us today for what I'm sure will be a very interesting conversation. So let's get right to it. Danielle, I want to start with you. In Florida and in California, we've seen ballot initiatives to re-enfranchise voters pass with overwhelming support. Can you talk a little bit about this recent trend and any differences between the California and the Florida efforts?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for that kind introduction. And thank you, everybody, for joining me on this panel today and everybody who's turning in. I have the opportunity to talk to you about one of the more exciting, I think, developments in voting rights, which is an increased energy towards restoring voting rights for people with convictions. People with convictions and laws disenfranchising people with convictions are our biggest remnant of Jim Crow that's left in our democratic system today. Even though we have seen extraordinary strides, some of which I'll talk about, we still have approximately 5 million Americans that cannot vote because of past convictions. And most of those folks are no longer in prison and are living in our communities, contributing to our communities, expected to pay taxes and send their children to schools, but are unable to participate in the decisions that their communities make about how they govern themselves. But fortunately, that is changing day by day. There has been a steady march for the past 20 years in slowly but surely changing these laws for the better. We went from a world in the 1970s and 80s where almost every state disenfranchised people with convictions largely permanently. That is thankfully no longer the case. Over 23 states have improved their laws since 1997. And in 2018 and 2020, we saw states do that by ballot initiative in two important states. In 2018, Amendment 4 passed in Florida, and this was a kind of landmark achievement because it was in a state that it has significant partisan divides, and yet the amendment to restore voting rights to people with past convictions passed overwhelmingly, had to clear a 60% threshold, and yet it did that, and restored the voting rights of up to 1 million people in Florida. And Florida was the worst offender, and it had really no chance of changing in the legislature. And so it was through the extraordinary efforts of Desmond Meade and other organizers in 2018 that led the charge to say, we believe that the Florida people will do better than the legislators and will re-enfranchise their communities. And Desmond proved right. And then in 2020, we saw, a continuation of this pattern of re-enfranchisement in California. Now, California was farther along in progress at the time of this ballot initiative. It re-enfranchised people after the completion of both prison and parole. And what we saw was them move that goalpost even one step earlier and re-enfranchise everyone who's on parole. So I think there are a couple of key differences between these two initiatives. One is that there was a much kind of more sweeping change in Florida from a permanent disenfranchisement system to rights restoration after completion of sentence. And in California, it was a kind of a smaller step forward because the state was already doing pretty well comparatively. But it's also a reminder that our most progressive states still have a lot of work to do on this issue. The state of New York could take the same step Governor Cuomo has of re-enfranchising people with on parole, but that can be made permanent in the state of New York. And there are many states that we would consider kind of overwhelmingly progressive that still have relatively backwards-looking felony disenfranchisement laws. The difference in how they got there is also present. In Florida, it had to be fought tooth and nail by organizers and the people collecting signatures to get it on the ballot. And in California, the legislature actually passed it and put it on the ballot for a constitutional amendment. But what's interesting is that actually in both states, it passed by about the same measure. And in fact, the Florida law passed by a slightly larger measure, which is to say that the American people are overwhelmingly in support of rights restoration, kind of whether you're in a red state, purple state, or blue state.
Thanks for that, Danielle. And Sean, I want to go to you now. Can you briefly explain the 2018 and the 2020 ballot initiative efforts in Missouri and some of the key takeaways that you all got from both cycles?
Yeah, so in Missouri, we worked for a couple of years from 2016, 2017, 2018 to pass a proactive initiative petition to really change the way business is done in our state legislature. That included redistricting reforms to make the process more transparent, independent, accountable to the people, but also other ethics reforms. So essentially eliminating lobbyist gifts, reducing campaign finance, limits, requiring the state legislature to follow the state's FOIA law that they had carved themselves out of. So that was a 2-year effort. We won big. We won essentially 2-1 in 2018. And then before polls even opened in 2018, the legislature that was none too keen on a better process, a more accountable process, especially on the redistricting side, they got to work figuring out how they were going to undo what the voters were passing in 2018. And so that's what we fought, and it narrowly passed what the legislature put forward in a pretty regressive redistricting proposal themselves. I think what's notable and interesting for our conversation today is that it was on us as the Vote No campaign to point out to voters that what looked like good reform, the legislature intentionally crafted their proposal to appear on the ballot to be very similar to what voters had already approved. They crafted it to look like something that voters would like, but all the nasty stuff was in the fine print. And so it was on us as the Vote No campaign to explain to voters that that folks are trying to get to try to trick them. And we came up short, and that was heartbreaking. We lost by less than 60,000 votes. But I think some of the takeaways throughout this 4-year fight and a fight that will continue in the next decade are that you really can build transpartisan coalitions to make government work better, and the details matter, and that early coalition work can really pay off. But you really have to be able to, especially when we're talking about long-term structural reforms, also help people understand why these long-term structural reforms have tangible benefits in their own lives. So I'm happy to get into all of that, but look forward to the conversation today.
Thanks, Sean. And Brian, I want to go to you now. So the path to get an initiative on the ballot in Virginia is quite peculiar compared to other states. Can you explain that process and more about you all's ballot initiative this year and the biggest lessons you learned along the way?
Sure. Yeah, Virginia's got a long road to hoe when it comes to actually amending our Constitution. And a lot of mid-Atlantic states are in the same bucket. So I hope what we did in Virginia can serve as maybe a little, even at the very least, inspiration, and maybe even somewhat of a blueprint for those other states like Pennsylvania and Maryland and North Carolina and Georgia, et cetera. But we're the opposite of California, where I think my friends in California can just, 10 of them get together and sign the back of a napkin. They can put something on the to amend their state constitution. Virginia, we've got to go through our legislature. There's no citizens initiative. So we go through our legislature, but we have to do it twice. And there has to be an election in between those two times you pass through your legislature. Thank goodness it's only 50% plus one. You only need a simple majority in both chambers to approve it. There's not a high threshold there. But the constitutional amendment that passed this November passed in February of 2019 when the Republicans had a narrow majority in both chambers. But it passed overwhelmingly. In the Senate, it passed 39-1. And in the House of Delegates, it passed 85-13. So overwhelming bipartisan support. Then we head into election season for Virginia, which was November of 2019. Our entire General Assembly was up for re-election. The Democrats flipped both chambers. They took back control. They had a 21-19 in the Senate, and then they had 55-45 in the House. And then our amendment comes back up. And the dynamics have changed a little bit. In the Senate, not much at all. The Senate, we still passed 38-2. And then the House, we passed 54-46. So it was a little bit of a nail biter there to whether we would even get the amendment on the floor of the House, but we did, and it passed, and that was tricky. And then the last phase in the amendment process in Virginia is it has to pass through the voters of Virginia. And we amend our Constitution fairly regularly, but usually they're very small tweaks. Like, for instance, the other ballot initiative we were on with in this November was a local option for a property tax exemption for, I think, surviving spouses of military families or something like that. So it was something, pretty small. This was the biggest by far we've done in our state constitution since we amended the whole thing back in the early 70s. So again, and unlike our friends in Florida who have like a 60% threshold, we only have to have 50% plus one at this phase two. Fortunately, this passed with 66% of the vote, which was really cool and really rewarding, and showed the kind of bipartisanship that we've been kind of working on and preaching about for One Virginia for the better part of 7 years now.
Great, thanks, Brian. And Brian and Sean, I want to ask both of you a question. You all dealt with ballot initiatives this year, And this year has been, extremely difficult for a lot of people for various reasons. One, the COVID-19 pandemic, which we're all dealing with and struggling with. And two, just from a political standpoint, this has been a highly partisan year. Presidential election years are always partisan, but this year it's probably hit an extreme point. So how were you all able to continue your ballot initiative campaigns with both the COVID pandemic and the highly partisan nature of elections this year?
Yeah, so in our campaign, we made the intentional choice to not be doing in-person events, and that had trade-offs. I think it was the right decision, but online conversations and phone conversations are not the same as in-person ones, and lit drops are not the same and don't have the same efficacy of actual conversations at the doors. And so, fingers crossed, knock on wood, we're all a little smarter about how to deal with public health crises, and we won't have this, for another century. And so, this is hopefully this is an unprecedented campaign challenge in our lifetimes. On the polarization issue, I mean, that's very real, and that was, part of what sunk us in the end. That the conversation from our opposition, Missouri is voting for Republican candidates statewide, right? And so Trump won, Governor Parson won by 16 points, and then we lost by 60,000 votes. And so, we had to be intentional about not getting, we knew that was going to be a problem. And so we worked hard to build bipartisan, transpartisan coalition from jump and to stay out of the national nonsense, because we knew that would be a loser for us. Also, it's not true. I mean, I think Brian can speak to this too, but these are, we are fighting for things that have universal value in terms of transparency and accountability and democracy that works for everyone. That is hard to do. And certainly there's a partisan tinge to some of that now, but it's on us as reformers to cut through that and to build coalitions of voters to make things work better.
Yeah, I'll add to what Sean said on the pandemic side. We obviously didn't do in-person events either, but we should have done lit drops and been less afraid of outdoor things, but we just didn't know to be, right? Knowing what we know now, I mean, I was washing our groceries back in March and April, and now we're willing to have an outdoor fire pit with a few limited number, that kind of thing. So we should have pushed that earlier, but we didn't know better, and we wanted to keep our volunteers safe. And we did a follow-up survey of ended up getting about 600 responses, and overwhelmingly the answer was, what prevented you from doing any of the following things, and it was always COVID, and that's understandable. As far as the kind of political polarization, what we found interesting, and Sean, you probably all found the same thing in Missouri in your polling. What was interesting to me is that the message worked across the board. So the message in Virginia was end partisan gerrymandering, right? They would also do other things, have transparency, make racial gerrymandering illegal under Virginia's constitution for the first time ever, all those good things. But the real top line messages that everybody wanted across, R's, D's, and I's was end partisan gerrymandering. So all we had to do was get that out there. Now, what made it tricky is hard to get something out there during a pandemic, and the messengers really matter, because against us, we had the state party in June the state Democratic Party in June adopt a resolution against the amendment after, being for it just before, right? And then late in the fall, we had the NAACP leadership come out against it, even though local NAACP chapters had been really supportive as well. So messengers matter in this. So on the Democratic side, we had the validators like Mark Warner and Tim Kaine, our two U.S. senators who are well regarded. We also had the Senate Democratic leadership, which was really helpful on that side as well. Senator Louise Lucas and Senator Mamie Locke, two leading state senators and leading in the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus. So that was really helpful to have. On the right, we had former Governor George Allen, who before he was even governor, when he was a congressman for a hot second, the Democrats in the early 90s drew him out of his district and into another district to pair him with an incumbent. So he's got a good story to tell about that. And he's a great validator on the right for us as well. But it was interesting because we kind of ran two separate campaigns, but with the exact same messaging. Like we didn't have to change our signs or our literature. We just had to swap out the picture of who was endorsing what. So weird times to do it, but we're glad that we were able to, the Democratic numbers in our polling showed pretty consistently that we were above 60% with Democrats. The Republican numbers lagged on this, but we worked really hard to get those up. And so, with the 66% of the vote, it looks like we won 2-1 in across most categories.
That's great. And Senator Mamie Locke was actually a professor at my alma mater.
She's the best.
Hampton University. So much love to Professor and Senator Locke. So Danielle and Sean, I wanted to ask you a question. Both of you all spoke about pushback after ballot initiatives were passed from the state. So, when you're doing a ballot campaign, once it passes, you're super excited. You think, oh, we won. This is the end. Hooray. And then you have these efforts from state politicians to kind of undo everything you spent years working for. So Danielle, I want to start with you first. Can you speak to efforts to overturn the win you all were able to achieve in Florida?
Yes. So I saw that one of our viewers asked this question. Dee Ellison asked, did the Florida legislation overturn citizens' votes to reenfranchise felons? And the answer is not quite, but kind of. Right. So the legislature knew that they couldn't overturn Amendment 4, which passed in 2018 to reenfranchise people with convictions. But they also knew that they were very unhappy with this potential change in the electorate. What I'll say about that at the outset, which is, quite frustrating, is it's pretty clear that Republicans in the Florida legislature felt as though the reenfranchisement of people with convictions would be harmful to them politically. And that's because of messaging around disproportionate disenfranchisement of African Americans in Florida, which was very real, and kind of perceived and real alignments between the African American community and the Democratic Party in Florida and elsewhere. But quite frankly, that kind of, the numbers don't add up there in Florida. While there is a disproportionate impact on African Americans, as what votes are counted in real numbers, and the real number of white voters that would be reenfranchised in Florida by Amendment 4 is actually substantially larger than the African American raw numbers of people who would be reenfranchised, and many of those voters you would expect, based on demographics, at least to many times support the Republican Party. So it's interesting at the outset to say that politics and perceived political benefits can kind of color how the politics around these issues play out, even if they're not. They don't actually match the numbers. But for whatever reason, the legislature felt like they needed to do something to undercut this law. And what they saw was an opening in the language. And this goes to the importance of ballot language and clarity. They saw an opening in the language because the language said after completion of sentence, all terms of sentence. And they said, aha, all terms of sentence. Well, as a legislature, we have already made it very difficult for people with convictions to get out of all of their terms of sentence because we've created a lot of financial barriers to completing your sentence. And so if we can make it clear that unless you get out of all these financial burdens that we've put on you because of your conviction, you can't vote, that's going to sharply limit the number of people who will be reenfranchised by Amendment 4. And that's exactly what they did. So they passed a law that said that you had to complete all of the legal financial obligations. So not only do you have to get off of parole and probation, but if you had an enormous restitution order or thousands of dollars in costs and fees tacked on, you have to pay those off. And of course, we know that most defendants in the criminal justice system in Florida are indigent, cannot afford to pay, and are not really expected to ever be able to pay off many of these fines and fees. This is just debt that exists and the state knows is largely not going to be collected. There was a long legal battle that CLC represented a class for in fighting that claiming it's wealth discrimination under the 14th Amendment, claiming it's a poll tax, and also bringing claims about due process, because it was incredibly difficult to even figure out what you needed to pay off and how in order to be able to be eligible again. And so we knew that even people who were eligible, or maybe only had to pay $100 or $200 in order to become eligible, just couldn't get through the bureaucracy to figure that out. We were successful before the district court. We were successful before the 11th Circuit the first time. We were successful with the district court again. And unfortunately this year, towards the right before the election, the 11th Circuit en banc court reversed our wins almost across the board. But what did happen during the litigation was that there was an incredible amount of energy poured into this issue and public attention and public outrage. It required the Secretary of State to create some improvements to the system so people could get through the red tape. It led to an outpouring of support to folks on the ground to help people pay off their fines and fees. And CLC and other groups on the ground and at the national level are working to make sure that folks can get through the system no matter how hard they make it. So the litigation bore some really important fruit, even though the loss was quite stinging in the 11th Circuit. The fight is not over there. And Desmond Meade and his group and all of the organizers that fought for this are not going to allow it to go by the wayside.
Thanks, Danielle. And Sean, can you talk a little bit about Missouri?
Yeah, so I mean, like, if you're part of the seminar with CLC, right? Like, you're interested in figuring out different ways to have a democracy, and you're interested in changing who has power. Like, the only reason you would do a ballot measure in a proactive, like, citizen-initiated way or a referendum is because the legislative process is broken and the people who are in power now are unresponsive to the people's needs. And so, if you're thinking about any sort of proactive measure, all of the things that will happen after Election Day have got to be a part of your plan, because folks who see themselves as a net loser, like, all of these things are not zero-sum games, but politicians often think of it that way, right? So, like, they are going to respond. Like, they don't have to just sit idly by while the citizens go and exercise their rights or take back their rights. And I would also say it's a very real, at least in the Missouri experience, that the concept of ballot measures bruises the egos of politicians, right? Like, they are just annoyed that anyone would be able to do some of this stuff without coming through them and getting their blessing. And so, from a practitioner's point of view, and it's been fun to see what's happening in the comments, like, the implementation and the post-election day planning can be as important as everything you do to get qualified, to get it on the ballot, and then to pass it. Because, for all the stories that Danielle has told about, the way the legislature gets really creative with their own attorneys of how to undermine the people's will. We've certainly seen that. And it's not just on democracy issues, right? Like, we have seen in Missouri politicians try to undo increases in the minimum wage or changes to clean energy rules, other stuff. So, like, ballot measures are hard. And the only reason that you would do them is because the system is broken. So I'll just leave it at that. But, like, yeah, like, politicians are going to react, especially if you're doing something meaningful.
Thanks for that, Sean. And I have just one last question for me before we open it up to the comments. You all spoke about the difference between the language that's on the ballot and the language that you have to draft. That's the actual statute that will be amended, or the Constitution that will be amended as a part of the ballot initiative. Danielle, you spoke a little bit about how legislators were able to find that one clause in the initiative and use that to their advantage. Brian, I think you talked about how you have to make sure voters can understand what's on the ballot and that the language can often confuse them. So can, just anyone who wants to jump in, explain how you balance making sure that the language is effective on both ends, both on the legislative end and the actual language that will appear on the ballot, so voters understand what they're voting for.
Everybody is being too polite. I don't have a ton of experience writing ballot language, so I'm really interested to hear what Brian and Sean, who probably have been a little closer to this, have to say. One thing I'll say about the Florida is example that I learned kind of looking back at the process a little bit from the litigation perspective is how many different things have to be balanced, right? The language that the lawyers would love after the fact, because it's just precise and just, just so, and has no kind of like openings, might not be the language that tests well, and that is like the most kind of appealing to voters. And in Florida, it was far from clear that this initiative would pass. At the time, it was a real, moonshot. And so trying to balance all of those different factors is, I know, something that folks who are crafting a ballot initiative have to think about, and that can be quite difficult.
Yeah, I would say, if you've got fatal flaws in the underlying text, like that can sink your whole deal. But also like the ballot language itself, what appears in front of voters, can be the whole ball game as well. So some of you all are in states, not everyone, and obviously in the comments is in a state where you can do initiative petitions. Some of you are in states where you can write your own. That comes with its own risks in the process, because if you do it wrong, like you could blow your whole thing up. But in Missouri, we are reliant on one statewide elected official to write language for us. And so like sometimes that goes well and sometimes it doesn't. But I would also say what other preconceived notions voter have on a particular issue can matter a lot. So if it's redistricting, we are nerds, like all of y'all are nerds, like you've probably thought a lot about redistricting, but normal people haven't. People have thought a lot about the minimum wage or legalizing pot or a lot of other issues that are also on the ballot. And so like it's a different set of challenges if people are already coming in with like, yep, thumbs up or thumbs down on the minimum wage, and the ballot language may matter less. But if it's something that's brand new to them that they haven't encountered, you have to figure out where and how you're going to have that conversation with voters to make sure that they feel equipped to vote the way you want them to.
In Virginia, the way we kind of have a pretty long tradition of doing very short constitutional amendments, as I mentioned, this constitutional amendment was a page and a half, which is like exponentially longer than anything we've done in 50 years. So we also had like supplemental enabling legislation that would go into the statute, would go to the Code of Virginia, that would go into effect only if the commission passed on the ballot. And that was a real fight to get through the legislature. And that's where a lot of the kind of key details and extra, I kind of said it took like a B level commission and would put it up to a B plus with those extra filters. And we worked with you all at Campaign Legal Center. We worked with the Common Cause, the Brennan Center, a lot of other experts to kind of craft really good enabling legislation that did eventually, after a lot of resistance from House Democrats, get through just after the election in a special session kind of thing. On the budget or on the ballot language side, I would suggest that Virginia, and maybe there's a lot of other states like this, I don't know, we don't get to write our own ballot language. We don't have a Secretary of State that has to approve it either, which is good. Ours goes through a committee, and it's a joint committee of the House and Senate, the Committee of Jurisdiction, so to speak. So it was the Privileges and Elections Committee. It was an interesting mix because we had some of our biggest supporters in the Senate side on that committee and some of our biggest opponents in the House side on that committee. And what we really pushed in there was we were really trying to avoid any kind of double negatives. We were trying to make it clear. Our vote yes side was willing to give on a couple things, like to put in that if the commission deadlocks, then it goes to the state Supreme Court, which is a net negative in terms of if you're asking Democrats to support it, they're afraid of our state Supreme Court, even though it's not Wisconsin or it's not, other states that are really partisan. But that was a talking point used against us then. And so we were willing to give on a little bit there to do it, but it was a very insider legislative game, which I'm not sure is the best way it should have been.
Thanks for that. And we have some questions from the comments that I'll try to get to now. Let's see. So this question is from Elizabeth Batiste, and she asked, how can we support states that don't have independent commissions or open redistricting processes to encourage people to participate in the redistricting process, specifically with communities of interest?
So the technology and some of just the best practices that are available to everyone, regardless of state, have improved dramatically and are much more democratized, like small d, democratized in 2021 than they were in 2011 or 2001. So there are tools out there to help literally map communities of interest and get those into the process as much as possible. In some places, I think victory is probably making sure everybody knows just how jacked up the outcome may be, or what some of the partisans are trying to do. And but the tools to create citizen maps and citizen proposed maps are far more accessible than they were even 10 years ago.
So when I was in my last year of law school in 2011, I got married before law school, so I wasn't going anywhere cool for spring break. And my election law professor asked me if I'd be willing to participate in this college student, grad student competition for mapping. It was 2011. It was in the spring 2011. And so I got a couple of other nerds and we participated. We ended up winning the congressional maps in there. And one of the reasons we won is because we showed Virginia should have a second minority influence district in the Richmond-Petersburg area. And that won us the competition. Now, no one gave a crap what we said in the legislature. They didn't listen at all to any of our maps. But then I go to this conference at Tufts University many years later. Dr. Moon-Duchin's putting it on for everybody, and somebody involved in the litigation in Virginia about the racial gerrymandering in our congressional district says, yeah, we saw this. I think it was these William and Mary law students that like put together this map that showed it was obvious you should have a second minority influence district. I'm like, oh my God, that's us. And they were like, yeah, that's the basis of that. So what I would say to Elizabeth, for folks that, if the legislature's not going to listen, you can always try and you should always do it. Sean's absolutely right. The technology will be available there. We have to create alternative, better maps. The good news is it's not very hard to create better maps than the legislatures do, right? They're horrible at it. Well, they're very good at it for their purposes, but not for ours. Producing better maps, engaging those communities that way. This is going to be the most transparent and open and accounted for redistricting we've ever had, just because the technology is not in the kind of high priesthood of gerrymandering consultants, but now it's available for average folks like all of us to use. We just got to pick up the tools and use them.
Yeah, I think the last thing I would add here is obviously redistricting commissions and kind of taking things out of the hands of the legislature. The whole point is that redistricting and partisan gerrymandering can insulate the legislature from caring about what their constituents think. But there are limits to the success of that. And so, creating political pressure and making sure that they know that their constituents are tuned in to hijacking the process and not, it's important for the legislature to know that there will be some sort of political price to be paid for partisan gerrymandering. So even where we know that perhaps the political price is not what it should be, that's not a reason for communities not to engage in a full-throated opposition of partisan gerrymandering as it's happening, and make sure that legislators know that there will be some sort of political price.
Thank you so much, Danielle. And unfortunately for our guest, Danielle has to jump off. So I just want to ask her for any last closing remarks before she leaves.
Thank you so much. I don't think I have anything much further to add. I think it's been really exciting to be able to talk with Brian and Sean in particular and kind of converse with folks who are on the ground. One of the things that CLC loves most about our policy work is the ability to kind of work really closely with state coalitions. So it's been really exciting to hear from the experts who are doing the work on the ground, and everybody here we'll have a great opportunity to learn from them a little bit more. So thanks, everyone. I'm sorry that I have to pop off a few minutes early. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Danielle. And we have a few more questions from the comments. So the next question comes from Sam Chang. And his question is, what is the prospect for online signature collection for ballot measures? I know that as a part of the COVID-19 pandemic, there were efforts to have online signature collection, and a lot of them actually failed due to courts. So Brian and Sean, if you could speak to those efforts and if you think there will be any progress in this area going forward.
So our legislature has proactively outlawed online signature gathering. I think, that's part of an overall set of attacks on the initiative petition process. As mentioned before, like, legislators generally hate the initiative process because, like, it's them giving up power. So Sam, I think it would be a great idea, and I think there's ways to do it safely and securely to connect the human being behind the signature and make sure they can be a part of the process. But I think the folks who are in power now are going to put up every hurdle they can.
So we don't really have like the signature collection route like other states do in that regard. But what I'll say this, and I think this also applies for voting, is I encourage everybody on here, don't buy into the false narrative that we can't have access and security. Right? It feels like too often the parties, or particularly on the right, but also on the left too, make it feel like there's a choice between one or the other, and we can have both. And you can see how well, folks like in Colorado have done voting and things like that. And so I feel like online signature collection is just the next step in this. And I hope that we'll see some engagement with that for simple fact that it just makes much, much, much more sense.
Great, thanks. And let's see, I'll go to the next question from the chat. This comes from D. Ellison. In working on the 2020 election, she learned of and became appalled and astounded at the amount of disenfranchisement in our country. Dee wants to know now, not just when there's another major election, but throughout the years going forward, how to change this situation. Specifically, she wants to know how she and anyone in the general public can work to improve the situation of disenfranchisement in this country.
So I think there's going to be, we learned a lot in 2020 with the pandemic voting about different ways that voting could be more accessible and not just on election day. So I think Missouri is one of many states where stuff that felt pretty distant in terms of advanced voting, is now going to become the norm. If activists, if leaders continue to work to keep the ball moving and to make some of the marginal gains permanent. I don't like disenfranchisement. I mean, that can be sliced a lot of different ways, Dee, so I'm not totally sure what you mean, but I think we've talked about redistricting here and reenfranchisement for ex-offenders or former offenders, but like the voting rights fight is going to be very real, and it's everything we've been seeing in the last couple of weeks at the federal level is not an abstract conversation. And so there's a lot to be worried about, but I think the solution is going to be local folks and nonpartisan campaigns fighting to, cut through the nonsense coming out of DC.
I was so inspired by the work Desmond and others did in Florida several years ago on this, and I'll say that kind of lesson learned out of that, or that I think that highlights as well, but that we always viewed in Virginia is, you cannot make these issues a left-right issue. If you do, you might win in the short term, but you are going to lose in the long term because the other side's going to, try to pull it back or whatever. So you've got to really hold this in the not left, right, but the right, wrong framework. And to the point that Danielle made about, Florida, like just as many, or more white folks than black folks were being reenfranchised. And like, once you get that education out there, it starts to really put it in the right, wrong framework, which is a better one anyway. I'll say that our secret sauce in Virginia I include disinformation in terms of disenfranchisement too, right? Like that's a big part of that out there, is we had trained up volunteers over the last 5 years to work the polls on election day. And basically, even when we didn't have anything on the ballot, we said, hey, thanks for coming out to vote. Go in and get your sticker. Once you're done, come and talk to me about gerrymandering for a second. And we would have these folks, and they would really, and not only did they get a lot of signatures on our it's an informal petition, but they educated a lot of folks, but they also learned about it themselves. So we had this cadre of 500 just amazing volunteers that can go all to any level you want on redistricting conversations about how it's bipartisan, what it's truly a fair process. It's not going to slant it for Republicans or Democrats. They were really darn good at that, and I think that makes all the difference in the long run, because you really have to build that kind of grassroots support, and you'll be able to withstand any kind of disinformation or any kind of whatever. And I think the same is true for the kind of enfranchisement discussion.
Thanks for that, Brian. And I did, just want to ask a follow-up to that. This year, we saw a lot of disinformation or misinformation campaigns, specifically online. What are some other ways, both, Brian and Sean, that you all have worked to combat these misinformation or disinformation campaigns that often confuse voters and make them think they're being asked to do something that a ballot initiative actually isn't asking them to do?
That is the challenge, right? I mean, if it was easy, we would have done it and we would all be doing it already, right? I mean, I think one of the interesting dynamics about the larger reform movement is like we've got to be on point and accurate all the time because we're trying to change the way things are. And then the other side, defenders of the status quo do not feel so compelled to, be honest and accurate about what they're trying to do. And so that's just very real, and that is that's got to be baked into your plans and your contingencies of just how you're gonna deal with nonsense. Some of that comes down to, as Brian mentioned, having relationships and doing the work over the long haul, so people understand who's been fighting for them and who they trust. The messengers, as we talked before, are extraordinarily important. If it was just as simple as like the facts, like a whole lot of our world would be different. But like the who and the how matter a ton in winning these campaigns and changing things.
So I'm personally a Democrat, and it was really disheartening to me that my state party endorsed against the voting rights thing that I've been working on for years, not because I've been working on it, because I thought we were all on the same page. And what I realized in the folks that we had attracted in terms of just volunteers, and we had Republicans, Democrats, Greens, Libertarians, none of the aboves. But the common theme with all of them is that they didn't hold it against our efforts that we had worked with folks on both sides of the aisle. Right. And there were a lot of Democrats who came back and started saying, we hear feedback during the campaign season. Well, Republicans did this to us for years, which isn't exactly true. But now it's just our turn to screw Republicans. Right. And I was like, whoa, that's not a usual Democratic talking point that you hear, kind of to the victors go the spoils. And by the way, that doesn't work in the long run very well either. I think there's a degree to which the folks that just say, I want to screw the other side, you're never going to get, but you need to really elevate and work with folks that are going to hold it and be okay with the bipartisan nature of it. Because there's some things that, there's big conversations we need to have in this country about climate, about energy, about how we take care of people and healthcare and schooling and all that stuff. But I feel like we can't get to those conversations unless we have a fair structure that actually represents the people and not just some kind of vested interest or legacy interest that doesn't there. So I think build up those folks and focus on them, and don't worry too much about the haters with their just our turn to screw the other guys.
Thanks, Brian. And we have a question from Stephen Harris. So he asked, would someone speak about ranked choice voting and where it stands? And additionally, is there any means to encourage the third of Americans who didn't vote to vote? And so I can touch on ranked choice voting just a little bit. So ranked choice voting is a system that allows voters to not just choose one person, but to choose multiple people. So it's similar to a survey you may take where you say, okay, what's your first choice? What's your second choice? What's your third choice? The ranked choice voting system allows voters to choose or rank candidates in a way that allows not just the Republican and Democrat nominee to advance to the next election, but the top two choices overall to advance the general election. We've seen initiatives, ranked choice voting initiatives around the country. It recently won in Alaska. Unfortunately, we don't have our Alaska panelists here to discuss this, but it lost in Massachusetts. And we expect to see more efforts to expand the use of ranked choice voting around the country as we move forward. Brian and Sean, just your general thoughts about if you want to touch on ranked choice voting, or the second half of the question, which is how do we get that third or 33% of American voters who choose not to vote every year to actually vote and believe in our democracy?
Yes, I think the biggest hurdle on ranked choice voting often is just not being comfortable or familiar with how it might work, right? Like once voters learn about it and how it empowers them and, can cut through some of the worst parts of American politics, like it wins. But it does disrupt the current order, and like that can be a challenge for organizations who know how to work the current system, and so like they're not down with that. And so I think that's also part of why you have seen a lot of focus on the local level, to show local wins, get people comfortable with it at a municipal or a local level, and then I think you'll see more statewide wins as voters just become more comfortable with the concept and the details.
Yeah, I think ranked choice voting is obviously one of those, we've got to do it, but it starts at a lower level than polling wise than redistricting reform does, which makes it tougher, right? And we saw that, the folks in Massachusetts ran a really good campaign and did, in theory, did everything right and still came up short. But the lessons in Massachusetts are that a lot of the cities, or I think almost all the cities, were overwhelmingly in support of it. So maybe that works, right? Like in Richmond, we've got a weird way to elect our mayor. We could add in ranked choice voting. It would be much more representative instead of having our mayor get elected with 38% of the vote. Ranked choice voting would help address that problem. And I don't know if our friends running the chat comments could put in there, but I think Catherine Gell and Michael Porter's work in their book that they released this year, The Politics Industry, is spectacular. And it takes what our friends in Alaska did, which is just really smart. Top 4 go ranked choice voting in the general. That's a really smart remedy and a good combination. And I hope folks will seriously consider that. Just as a quick status in Virginia, everyone should follow Delegate Sally Hudson, who's been leading the charge on this even before she was Delegate Hudson. She's a professor at UVA. But we've gotten a local option. So Virginians now will have an option in localities to adopt ranked choice voting, and we'll see how that goes. It kind of was, no one took up on it during the pandemic, but I think that's coming real soon to the Commonwealth.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian and Sean. And I guess this our last question, just going back to the second half of that. How do we encourage more voters or non-voters rather, to participate in our elections and believe in our democracy? A lot of the work both of you all do is centered around making politics work for everyone in ways that it currently doesn't work now. So can you just provide what you all individually think would be some great ways to encourage that, third of Americans who don't exercise their right to vote to get out and actually vote?
Yeah, so I think there are like tactical things that campaigns can do to encourage voting, I think. But a lot of it comes down to having conversations with folks who are on the margins, who are on the outside, and inviting them into the process. Folks who don't vote have made the rational choice that, or like in their minds, the rational choice that it doesn't matter, so why am I going to bother? And I think that cynicism is toxic on a whole lot of fronts. And so, you're not going to get everybody, but connecting how things could be different, how empowering voters, having relationship and being in dialogue with voters is part of that solution. But yeah, I think if America is going to survive and be the America that we need it to be, it's got to not just be decisions made by a small group of folks.
Yeah, to piggyback on what Sean says, we can create seats at the table and voices and allow folks to have a voice in the process like never before. But it only happens with these kind of democracy reforms that CLC and others have led the charge on. I don't blame anybody for not wanting to vote. It's often hard. They're crummy choices on the ballot, and a lot of times it's kind of predetermined, which is why I think these kind of reform efforts, whether it's redistricting, ranked choice voting, open primaries, and transparency measures, all those things are so critical because it'll chip away at that cynicism that's really kind of hard to argue against, right? Like it's an irrational thing to vote in a rigged election because it's been rigged for so many different reasons, right? Like it's technically irrational and we're just the weirdos that still do it. But we can, with our vote, we can make that change and have that democracy open up. And I think we're in that moment, right? Like, it feels like the kind of Gilded Age political progressive reforms we saw 120 years ago, where the secret ballot happened and women gained the franchise and we popularly elected our U.S. senators. Like we're in that moment now again. And so I think this is the time to push full steam ahead on all of those reforms and to lift the other ones up. Like I'm the redistricting guy, but we should be talking positively and sharing the gospel about the other stuff as well. So thanks a lot to CLC and everybody for participating in this, Caleb. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you both. And I did just want to mention that Brian earlier mentioned Catherine Gale. In CLC, we hosted an event with her last year, similar to this one. And if you go to the comments, you'll find our section on our website about ranked choice voting, where you can find the virtual event we hosted with Catherine Gale. So I'd just like to ask if any of our visitors and guests have any final questions, and if not, we'll wrap up.
Now, this stuff that we're talking about, that all that we're fighting for, is not easy, but it is meaningful and it's important. And so I think there's a lot of ways to lose campaigns. There's a lot of reasons to be encouraged or discouraged, but these wins matter, and they make our government better for all of us and for the folks who come after us. So, just encourage everyone to stay in the fight, and thanks for everything that you're already doing.
Thanks, Sean. Any final words from you, Brian?
I would just say that all this stuff looks impossible until it's done, right? And if you need look no further than Michigan and Katie Fahey's story, like how the hell would somebody like her ever be able to do something like she did? And she's a very special person, but she's also just like the rest of us. I think that's something we should take from these last couple years of reforms and looking at that, is that, it only looks impossible until you do it, and we can really do this. And so, thank you for raising the conversation and the efforts, and Sean, pulling for you all in Missouri and other places. So, it's nice to be a part of this.
Thanks, Brian. And so to wrap up, the state ballot initiatives that we've discussed today show that even in a very polarized era, it is important to get bipartisan consensus on key democracy reforms. Fundamentally, expanding voting rights, getting money out of politics, and creating independent redistricting commissions benefit all of us. They have also shown how confusing or purposefully deceptive ballot language can dissuade people from voting for democracy reform who might have otherwise voted. Grassroots activists should fight to have clear language on ballot initiatives when possible, and conduct robust voter education campaigns to ensure that anti-democracy advocates and wealthy special interests are not the ones framing the conversation, or in Brian's words, rigging the election. Voters have a right to know which wealthy special interests are spending big money to secretly influence our vote, and our government to rig the political system in their favor. Real transparency about how spending big money on elections will mean more government accountability, less influence for wealthy special interests, and less political corruption. So once again, I'd just like to thank Brian and Sean and Danielle for being here today and educating us all on the ballot initiative process. If you have any additional questions or would like more information, please email us at info@campaignlegalcenter.org. Thank you all again, and I hope you have a great afternoon.